Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. As many of you listen to the show know, a lot of times we like to interview World War II veterans because World War II ended a little over 70 years ago, and it's very precious when we have time to talk to one of these veterans. And I'm very proud right now to have with me Harold Brown, one of the Tuskeegee Airmen. How you doing today, sir?
I am just doing great.
Okay, so now some of the younger members in the audience, and actually some of our older ones, they may not know who were the Tuskegee Airmen.
Well, the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of black pilots. And let me just give you just about a few minutes of history. As you recall, back in the 30s and 40s, we had long-standing policies on racial discrimination. As a matter of fact, not only by law, but by tradition. And we had the so-called equal but separate law that went into effect. And as we started approaching World War II, it was evident that they were going to need a whole lot of pilots. And there became a big argument between the War Department, made up of generals and so forth, and we had people on our side like Senator Truman, Senator Dirksen from Illinois, who was supporting us in terms of us getting a shot at becoming military pilots. Well, there was a big argument, as you would expect, but our guys finally won out, and they finally decided to start a small training program with a limited number of people down in Tuskegee Institute. Well, it was Tuskegee, but right at the Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. So this is how the whole thing started, and that was announced in 1941. Now, the initial requirements were for college graduates or people which had 2 or 3 years of college. And as you would expect, that pool of potential pilots rapidly ran dry, both white and black. And particularly amongst blacks, there wasn't that many college graduates back in those days. So then someone said, well, let's just take high school kids. If they can pass the exam and if they can pass the physical, we'll accept them into military flight training. And that's how I got in. I graduated from high school in 1942. I was 17 years old. I had a love affair with airplanes when I was back in the 6th grade. So as soon as I graduated, I immediately went down, took my written exams. When I turned 18 in August, I took my physical exam, passed it, and I got my letter in December of 1942 that I had been selected for flight training. And then in January is when I left home on my way down to Biloxi, Mississippi, where they gave us our basic training in high school, in the military. And then from Biloxi, Mississippi, we were sent up to Tuskegee Institute.
Okay, so you're starting your way in your military career. After your training, where were you sent? Where were you stationed?
Okay, I was the first squadron they sent over the 99th to North Africa. The group, the 332nd Fighter Group, was finally sent over to the European theater, and they were stationed in Italy at a place called Ramitelli, which was right on the Adriatic Sea. And it was just about 35 kilometers north of Foggia. And the 15th Air Force had just about 600 bombers and roughly 7 fighter groups. They had 4 groups of P-51s and 3 groups of P-38s. And we were all stationed in that general area, which meant we were flying from north to south up into Europe against all the targets. And the mighty 8th Air Force over in England was flying from east to west, hitting targets. To give you some idea, the 8th Air Force they call it the Mighty Ace, they could put up 2,000 bombers and 1,200 fighters for maximum effort. So they were a big, big outfit.
Now, what was your job? What was your mission?
The 15th and the 8th Air Force had the same mission, and that was strategic bombings. We were escorting the heavy bombers, the B-17s and the B-24s, from their home bases in the various targets up in New York.
I understand you were shot down.
Unfortunately, you understand correctly, sir. I was shot down.
So what happened? Can you tell us what happened?
Sure, I do a rough little. I can tell you about a couple of bad things that happened to me. The first time was on my 12th mission, and we got tangled up with the ME-262. Now, the ME-262 was a brand new twin-engine jet that just came into operation towards the end of the war. Very fast, 100 miles an hour faster than our P-51s. And they jumped us one day, and they attacked our bombers. My wingman and I picked one up, and we followed him all the way down to the ground. Well, he's going at maximum speed, whether he's going straight down or whether he's flying straight and level. Now, when we go straight down in our 51s, we are not at our maximum speed. So I'm picking up a little speed on him, and he's not separating as fast away from me as he could if he was flying straight and level. Long story short, he led us over a flak trap. I got hit, and my wingman and I were trying to get back, and I had fuel exhaustion, but I did get back to northern Italy out of fuel and spotted an old abandoned landing strip, but death sticked it on the landing strip, tore it to pieces, and as I tell all of the kids and things that I tell them this story, I said, and what do you think I did then after I crash landed? And they looked very puzzled. I said, well, I jumped out of the aircraft, and I brushed off my uniform, and I said, fantastic job, hero. Great job. And they get a big kick out of it. But on my 30th mission, we were on a strafing mission, and my aircraft was damaged from an exploding locomotive. Just as I passed over it, it blew up, damaged my aircraft. We were just south of Linz, Austria, hilly country, right there close to the Alps, and I had to bail out of it. And I had no other choices. So I bailed out, and I was picked up about 30 minutes after bailing out by a couple of constables. And then I started up on what was the most horrible adventure I had during the entire war.
Now, what was it like for you, an African-American captured by the Nazis?
That becomes quite interesting. When they picked me up, they took me back to, and by they I'm talking about the two constables who escorted me back into the little village that we had been strafing. And if you stop and think about it a minute, supposing you were there and here comes a bunch of airplanes shooting up the place, not shooting at people, shooting at legitimate targets, shrapnel's flying all over the place. A piece of shrapnel might hit your wife, your kid, your mom, your dad, whatever. You're going to be pretty doggone angry when you see this guy bail out, and all of a sudden here he comes walking in with the two constables. And that's what I face. About 40 of the angriest people I have ever witnessed in my life. And they made it perfectly clear, they were hollering and screaming at me, that they were going to do me in. And they made certain that I understood that I was going to die within the next few minutes. Well, as luck would have it, there's always one good person in the crowd, and there was a constable way in the back who slowly walked around to the front, stepped in front of me, put a round in his rifle, and kept those people from killing me. Now, if you think about that for a moment, that constable had to know everybody in that crowd. He probably even had some of his own friends and family in that crowd. But he kept those people from killing me. We backed up about, what would amount to a couple of blocks. We went into a pub. He ran everybody out. We barricaded ourselves in that little pub. And then as evening came on, this was wintertime in March of 1945, they slowly started to disperse. And by midnight, they had all dispersed. And we went out the back door and we walked about 4 or 5 kilometers down to the next village where they got on the phone with someone. They called down, and in a short while, a couple of soldiers came in and picked me up. And from that point, I was in the custody of the German army. And the only thing that you really had to worry about then was to get into a prison camp safely, because you were traveling from where you shot down to the prison camps. And my first prison camp was in Nuremberg, Germany, and that was also where they had the interrogation center, which had come from Frankfurt because the Americans were advancing pretty closely. But if you were able to do that and didn't attempt to escape, then you had no problems. But in answer to your question, how do they treat me, I tell everyone jokingly that that was the first time that I had experienced integration in my life, because I was there with Canadian pilots, English pilots, Australian pilots, you name it. And we were all there together, and no one could care less. We were all POWs, and all we had on our mind was just surviving the war, and all we had to do was suffer a little hungry, and we were always hungry. But that's all we had to do, and the only other thing is don't attempt to escape, and you could survive the war, and that's what we did.
Now, where were you when the war was over?
As I said, I first went to Nuremberg, but I was only there a short while, about 10 days. There was about 10,000 of us there. We were on a forced march, and we walked from Nuremberg down to Moosburg. Moosburg is about 30 kilometers north of Munich. And there were already thousands of prisoners in Moosburg, which was a very well-known prison camp. And that is where I was at. And within a couple of weeks or so, General Patton came through on April the 29th and tore down the fence and liberated all of us.
So how'd you feel at that moment? Can you describe it?
Happy. Very happy. As a matter of fact, I don't know what you know about General Patton, but you know he was a big man, about 6 foot 2 inches tall, and as you've seen all of his picture, he wears the breeches and the boots, and he wears 2 pistols on his hip. And he had one of the filthiest mouths you ever want to hear. Every other word was, use your imagination, and that's what came out of his mouth. And he loved the crowd, and with every one of those nice 4-letter words he used, the whole crowd, there were thousands of us standing there as he was standing on his Jeep, they were screaming, "Yay, Patton! Yay, Patton!" And he was responding, "I'm on my way to Berlin, and when I get there, I'm going to catch that paper hanging dash, 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 and I'm going to do dash, dash, dash to him. You can fill in the dashes." And that was what he was telling us that he was going to do. But that was Patton. I'll tell you a little story about Patton. You know, he always carried 2 guns. And their story isn't supposed to be true. This reporter was interviewing Patton, and he says, "Sir, why do you carry those 2 ivory-handled pistols on your hips?" And he says, "Son, let me tell you something. The only man who carries a pearl-handled pistol is a pimp down in New Orleans. These are ivory-handled pistols, and don't you ever forget it." A true story, but it sounds pretty good, just like Patton.
All right, now the war's over. What do you decide to do for your career?
Well, I came home from the war. I was 20 years old, wasn't old enough to vote, couldn't go into a bar legally. But I decided that I wanted to make it a career, so I stayed in the military until I served for 23 years in the military. I went back. My first assignment was back to Tuskegee, and that was the only base we had besides one other base, Godman Field, which had the other Tuskegee pilots, the B-25 pilots who didn't get overseas because the war ended too soon. And we all wound up at Lockbourne Air Force Base, and that was from 1946 to 1949. Now, an interesting thing, when I was down at Tuskegee, I joined them in September of 1945, and I was an instrument flight instructor. Well, I was up practicing one day underneath the hood, and you have a safety pilot up in front. And as we were flying along, all of a sudden there was this horrible noise and rocking of the aircraft, and I said, my God, we had a mid-air collision. And I come out from underneath the hood, and we had a mid-air collision. The instructor and cadet in the other T-6 bailed out of their aircraft. We took off their whole espionage. Our aircraft was heavily damaged, but we managed to land it safely. So I was just at that time 21 years and 2 months old, and I've had a crash landing. I bailed out of an aircraft, and I survived a mid-air collision. So I figure I was a pretty lucky young guy. But I stayed in, and I served in Korea. I came back, and I finally wound up in the Strategic Air Command, SAC, and I was flying the B-47. The B-47 was the first six-jet engine bomber, and that's what I did the last 10 years of my career in the Air Force, and I retired with 23 years of service.
Now, if somebody wants to read about your career, you've got a book out. What's the name of your book?
I'm looking at a stack of them right now in big, bold red letters, and our P-51s were all painted with red tails, and we were known as the red tail fighter pilots. Well, in big, bold letters, they got it in red, and it is Keep Your Airspeed Up, the story of a Tuskegee Airman.
Keep Your Airspeed Up. Where can we get the book?
Airspeed Up, the story of a Tuskegee Airman.
Where can we get the book?
Well, they're available at Amazon, almost all of the major bookstores, and I think they even have a Kindle version available. So it is widely available. And I suppose if you wanted to get one fast, Amazon, you just give them a call, and in a day or two, it's at your doorstep.
So what are you doing with yourself now, Colonel, besides writing books and autographing books?
Oh, my goodness. After I left the military, I had been an instructor pilot all throughout my career, and I thought I would really like to continue in that field. So I went into education. I started with a little school in Columbus, Ohio, grade 13 and 14, and it was called the Columbus Area Technician School. We had 3 programs, 67 students, and 12 faculty members. Today, that school is 30,000 students enrolled, the largest community college in the state of Ohio, and is Columbus State Community College. I went up the ladder and became the vice president of the school, and when I retired from them, we only had just about 10,000 students. But other than going back to school, I went back and my PhD from Ohio State back in 1973. I got my PhD. So I was in education. I retired from them in 1986. I then did what most retired educators do. I opened up Brown and Associate, a consulting firm. So I consulted, and I had a continuing contract with the Ohio State Board of Career Colleges and Schools, the Ohio State agency which regulates all of the profit-making schools in the state of Ohio. And I had a continuous contract with them until I quit them in 2012. And I also had my own private firm on the side. So that's what I did from 1986 up until 2012 when I retired from everything.
Well, listen, thank you for sharing your story with us. Keep Your Airspeed Up by Dr. Brown, Colonel Brown. Thank you again. I hope your book does well. And if you're ever in New York, come see us.
And I will most certainly do that. And I thank you so much for this opportunity. It was really a pleasure. And